Hi, welcome again to another Plus Program training series. Today's topic is grains, and this is part 2. Well, as we were talking about before, grains have a tendency to be maybe the topic of doom, so to speak, nowadays. A lot of people obviously still eat grains all the time. In fact, 1/3 of the world's population uses grains as a staple every single day. A lot of people are talking negative about it, and we were talking in the first series that, hey, we're going to bring a little bit of light into the grain world a little bit, so to speak, and maybe expose to you maybe the benefits of whole grains as well as maybe some of the negative things of refined grains. And so we kind of did that in the first part, but we'll definitely do a little bit of a review, so to speak, to get you up and rolling if you haven't watched the first part. And then in this series, we're going to also look at some other grains that maybe you haven't been exposed to before. All right, so right off the bat, looking at a little bit of the history, we look at the word actually grains and where it kind of comes from. The word cereal grains is which we typically call grains. Obviously, grains come from different types of cereal grasses, but the word cereal grains actually came from Ceres, which was actually a goddess that supposedly overlooked the Roman Empire's agricultural industry. So that's maybe where we get that word, and it seems to be the most likely link, so to speak. A couple of significant things about grains. We actually see that they were cultivated over 10,000 years before Christ, or BC. And ultimately, that kind of gives us a very long history knowing that grains were out there. 5,000 BC, we see very aggressive culturing of grains, especially up through the area between Egypt all the way up to Turkey, what is now known as Turkey area. And they called this the crescent fertilization area, where we actually had a lot of growth of different types of colonies as well as different types of countries. A couple of significant reasons. Number one, grains obviously are perishable, but they also are not very long-term, or they're very long-term perishable, so to speak. They will last for 2 to 3 years, a lot of them. So what that does is it gives us a source or a crop, an indigenous staple that lasts for a long period of time, especially when it comes to storage, transportation, and things of that nature. The other thing is when we started domesticating animals and using them as a labor force, so to speak, the feeding of animals was largely dependent upon grains as well, too. So it kind of gives you a little history. A lot of civilizations would have never developed had they not aggressively cultivated and agriculturally paid attention to grains. All right, a couple other significant things when we look at grains is this. There's different types of grains, whole grains and refined grains. One thing that's significant for us is the refined grains actually become a problem. And so when we look at the types of grains that are in use, so to speak, in the United States, there's 4 dominant grains in use. Number one, we have wheat. Wheat, as we were saying before, 1/3 of the population literally around the world relies on wheat as a food source or a staple. Number 2 is corn, especially in the western United States, as well as also through Mexico and Central America. Corn is a huge staple, and we see it in a lot of different uses. The other thing we see also as well as oats. A lot of oats, believe it or not, are used for the feed and livestock industry, probably more so than actually food for human. Although oat consumption, once again, has become very popular here in the United States because of the heart-healthy benefits. And finally, rice, very aggressively used in the Eastern Asian countries, especially in China, Japan, things of that nature. Some individuals eat up anywhere from 200 to 400 pounds a year. That's a lot of rice if you think about it. It's a lot of rice to be consumed. All right, so that kind of lays a foundation. Also, what's the difference between a whole grain as opposed to a processed grain? Well, whole grain is indeed any grain before it has been tampered with, so to speak. Anytime we take the grain and we start maybe mashing or beating it or refining it or milling it, that is a whole grain. So what does it mean to be refined? Well, we take it, we throw it through a couple different types of processes. We take off the outside, which is called the bran. We also take out the germ, which is the area that actually causes the grain itself to sprout or to be able to grow. And those areas are where all the nutrients are. Well, why would we do that? Well, when we get the endosperm, or the inside portion, so to speak, this particular substance, when ground up and used, produces a very nice dough. So when it comes to bread making, which is super common for wheat here in the United States, it just is more workable, quote unquote. The other thing is it preserves a lot longer. And so when it came to white flours and white types of breads, the whole advent of that, not knowing that those nutrients were being taken out, what we found is it would preserve longer on the shelf. Well, this, of course, added to the fact that, well, that makes sense. We can preserve it longer, we can use it, so forth and so on. The big catapult situation was, though, we lost all these nutrients. And when we lost the nutrients, then we see actually an inset, so to speak, of certain types of diseases, specifically cardiovascular disease, as well as diabetes, as well as certain types of cancers are linked to the overconsumption of processed grains. Unprocessed grains or whole grains actually have just the opposite effect. They actually decrease those particular types of diseases. A lot of you might be thinking, well, I don't eat wheat and I don't really want to use rice or things of that nature. Are there different types of grains? Well, absolutely. So looking at a list here, we see some significant grains of choice that seem to be super popular. Number one, amaranth. What's popular with amaranth, it was an Aztec grain and actually helped to sustain and be a staple for the Aztec Indians for a long period of time, actually making them not only nutrient rich, so to speak, but also providing all sorts of different proteins and fibers, which actually helped that civilization to be able to sustain for a long period of time. All right, so if you want the gift of the Aztecs, you want to definitely eat amaranth. All right, next on the list that you're going to look at is buckwheat. It is not wheat, it is buckwheat. It's totally different. It actually comes from a fruit area. What's unique about buckwheat, it has no gluten. It can be used almost like wheat in certain situations. And a lot of people that are gluten-free really like the attributes of it. All right. So one significant thing to finalize buckwheat is very digestible protein. All right. Next on the list, we see quinoa. Quinoa is definitely like the grain, so to speak, of the future. Everyone's using quinoa. It's real hip. All the hipsters are using it. A couple of unique things. Number one, very central to certain areas down in South America. Definitely a staple. One thing about quinoa, good in protein, also rich in vitamins, minerals, and nutrients, made a great staple in a lot of different areas, very easy to digest for a lot of individuals. All right, next on the list, we actually see a very unique one called millet. That's oftentimes called birdseed. One thing about millet, it's highly significantly used in a lot of different areas, especially in Africa. And one thing about millet is a complete protein, making it a very good staple in a lot of areas that maybe lack different types of proteins as well. And finally, last on the list is spelt. And what's unique about spelt is this. It's definitely a wheat or a wheat family. It's a wheat cousin. It's definitely linked a lot less tight, so to speak, than the gluten of today's wheat, making it a lot more easy to digest. Some individuals that are gluten sensitive can digest and use spelt pretty effectively. All right, so last on the list, a lot of people say, well, I can't digest grains. I have a difficult time digesting grains. A couple significant things you can do. You can take whole grains, soak them overnight, and then whatever application that you're using, use it. And at that point, because the soaking actually helps to break down the cell wall, make it much easier to digest, especially if you take it and cook with it a little bit later in any type of application. Another thing that's gotten a lot of popularity is what is known as lacto fermentation. Lacto fermentation, where you actually take either the whole grain or you take the flour and you actually put it in with kefir. And kefir actually kind of helps to pre-digest all the proteins and the carbs, making it, once again, something that you use the next day after soaking all night and making it much more digestible on the system. And finally, sprouting. Real common for different types of people to use sprouts, but there's a great company here in Southern California called Food for Life, Ezekiel Breads. They actually sprout the grains and then actually make bread from there, making it a much more digestible product to be able to get in the system. All right, so that kind of rounds everything up, gives you a little history about grains, maybe shows you maybe a little bit of difference, and also maybe some ways to use it for easier digestion in your every single day habits, so to speak, and be able to maybe give you a little bit of a distinction on how grains have some great benefits. Thanks again for watching another Plus Program training series. This is Starkie Sowers.